Question for this week is, you have limited time with an athlete. How do you prioritize what you choose to do with that time? Probably keep the discussion to twice a week or less, which in our context means about 2 hours or 1 hour quite often.
All right, so I think you have to look at what type of athlete you're working with, and I think Matt and I talked about this a little bit beforehand, but you gotta look at the sport. Are they female or male? What's their training experience, things like that. And I think then you can start to pare down maybe what you do. Do you guys have where would you guys start, I guess?
I think training experience is like one of the bigger ones, because you got to look like what's their main goal. You know, if training age is really low, it almost simplifies itself, and you don't need to be complex with the time you have. You just keep it simple and get the work done.
Yeah, I think pretty much always I'm going to have sprinting in a program if they're doing any kind of sprinting in their sport. And so with someone who's inexperienced, that could start off with as simple as marching drills on the wall, talking about posture, doing resisted runs and covering pushing and concepts like that. Someone more advanced, that's going to be something different. But that concept of speed work and sprinting is pretty much always in there. Lower body strength pretty much always is a squat. That might be a goblet squat with a young kid, or someone who's more advanced, it might be on the K-box, something more eccentrically loaded. But pretty much always squatting and sprinting are in my programs.
Yeah, you said the marching drills. I don't usually go with that as much, but I think sometimes I can do it like paired between like a sprint drill or something like that. But a lot of the time I'll make it just sprinting and then kind of see where they're at, where Mike says this sometimes, like do the self-exploration and a lot of learning of the time, learning a lot of time. And then the other thing is the squatting, I think that's the most bang for your buck exercise with a lot of beginners. I think make a lot of strength gains just doing that. I do that sometimes. Just if I have twice a week, I'll squat with them twice a week. That'll be my main lower body multi-joint exercise. I don't know, do you guys put lunges in sometimes, or?
It depends. So after a little while, maybe if you're training this person limited amount of time per week, but over the course of a few months, if squats are doing really well, you might be able to get to a point where you can load them enough on one day that day two, if say you have them 2 days, is some variation. So semi-unilateral, like a split squat or something like that, or whatever else. Even introducing some Olympic lifting, if you have 2 days, like you get to a certain standard, you can start to add some variation. Since you have the time. But if you have 1 day a week, that could still happen, but it's going to take longer, basically.
Even if I can find time to get 2 sets of a unilateral or a kind of semi-unilateral exercise in, I find that valuable. There's plenty of reasons why you can support that. But especially if it's 2 days a week, I think it's pretty easy to find that time just to get 2 sets in towards the end of a workout. Even if it's 1 day a week, potentially rotating exercises. So on one phase, we're putting more of an emphasis on the actual squat, and then later maybe it moves to a step up, something that we can still treat as a strength stimulus on that 1 day a week, but also be hitting on unilateral strength, at least at one point within a training cycle or a training year.
Yeah, and I think in my cases, I have a lot of younger athletes with almost no training experience. So for me, I feel like, I'm familiar with the research in that just getting max strength, you'll raise all other physical capacities. Just work on squat and get their squat really high if they're a 13-year-old girl or a 14-year-old girl. And I'm not talking half squatting 300 pounds, but I think good quality squats, barbell, or like you said, start with a kettlebell or dumbbell. And then I've seen really, really impressive improvements. I think a lot of that could be development, just that they're maturing. But then you're pairing that with, some sort of strength work where the nervous system is adapting, they're getting more coordinated, and then they can hit the ground harder in sprinting and stuff like that. I also, like you said earlier with the sprinting, I always make sure that, or I try to make sure I check that box too. Like, do you sprint? Okay, in your sport, we're going to sprint. And then is max strength a benefit for you? Yeah, I'm probably going to do a squat and a sprint right away to get in a lot of them, to load them quite a bit.
Maybe the next thing I look for, if I have time, we're talking about strength, is to get an upper body strength exercise in. And no question for me, pull-ups are the best bang for your buck there. Something like, if we're going to get to pressing, a push-up is going to be a little bit more economic than a bench press, just because you're going to get a core load with it as well. But pull-ups are going to be the top priority for me when it's becoming between the two of them.
Sure. I like to get, obviously, upper body strength, no matter if it's primarily lower body athlete. Same thing, I like to throw in the upper body. But sometimes when I'm looking for a pulling motion, especially with more inexperienced athletes, I'll go with a ring row before I do a pull-up, just because I think when you have someone who can't do pull-ups very well, you put them on a band or something like that. I don't think that's the best option to develop strength, although it is maybe the most logistically simple to start into pull-ups. It's kind of a separate discussion on strength right there, but ring row is really nice. Overhead presses, if shoulders allow, things like that. And the other thing to bring up, I think, is what about like plyometrics? How do these take priority? I know kind of my answer, but what do you guys think?
Yeah, I mean, I personally like to use Jim Radcliffe's progression a lot of the time with younger athletes. Not even younger athletes. I think most athletes, it builds a good base of athleticism. The progression, if you viewers aren't familiar with it, it has movement-based plyos, so where you're jumping from one foot to the other, or 2-footed contacts, and you're alternating which foot is hitting the ground, and then it's a pretty smooth progression. And then there's lateral plyos, there's the bilateral plyos with squat jumps and stuff like that. So I'll use those, but I almost for time, I will, instead of teaching an Olympic lift, especially with, like I said, a lot of my clients, I'll pair it where I'll go squat, maybe rocket jump, squat, rocket jump, squat, rocket jump, and then progressing it forward. I really won't progress up the volume too much within those, but I'll progress to different exercises that are inherently more intense.
Sure.
So I might go rocket jump to butt kick jump, and then from there I might go to knee tuck jump or something like that. And that might take the place over 6 to 8 weeks if I only see them 2 days a week, just to seeing on how their contacts are and stuff like that. I don't know where you stand on
Well, a lot
that.
of times, just in general, if I'm going to be on any time tight schedule, but quite often, even if I have more time just to be able to fit things in, I do this. I'll put things in some sort of a cluster. So that can be plyos paired with sprinting in the same segment. So stiffness jumps, 60-second rest, and then into the accel rep there. So it can be a way that when you maybe would just have been typically resting before your sprints, you can get a little bit of work there and potentially get some post-activation potentiation going on. Same thing would then go for if I am on a tight schedule doing Olympic lifts, particularly if it's someone learning. The Olympic lift isn't much of a stimulus yet. It's skill oriented. Mm-hmm. So maybe it's as simple as doing box jumps in between. So there's something that they can actually put a much more force into and get a training stimulus there while they would be resting between the power clean sets. So all the times I'll use plyos kind of integrated with other exercises around them.
Yeah, I got kind of 2 things based off that are real similar. Putting them in with sprinting. If you have a sport that is, somewhat unpredictable or a lot of change direction, and straight ahead sprinting isn't always super similar to the sport, I like to add some small jumps into a sprint. So it might be just calf pops, stiffness jumps into a acceleration, 10-15 meters. It might be some skater jumps side to side, or even a couple broad jumps rhythmically forward. You get some plyometric volume there, and you can sprint out of it. So it just gives you a different contact to try to be fast out of, which in field sport happens a lot. It's not exactly similar, but it's getting in that direction. And the other thing, going off of your second point, is pairing up plyometrics or explosive med ball throws or something like that with something that's still developing. I think that's really key with younger athletes. Even if the squat isn't that heavy because their squat isn't that good yet, you can get volume there, but that's a good opportunity to pair it with something explosive, because the squat's not taking enough out of them where the explosive effort isn't productive. So you can do that, get your squat pattern in, and then do something explosive, and go back and forth, or even add an upper body in there too, a little circuit based thing. So like we said in the beginning, it goes back to training history. A lot of this is we're talking about younger athletes, less experienced. Now, the more experienced your athletes are that you get, oftentimes the more they're willing to train, or the more they can train. But maybe we talk for a second about the context of a more experienced athlete still having short amount of time with them.
Or even often in season, high-level teams or high-level athletes will have this set up where the strength coach has 2 sessions a week, and maybe they're not even an hour. Maybe you got 30, 45 minutes to warm up and have a session. So I don't think this is uncommon at all, even at higher levels.
Yep. Yeah, I'd agree with that. And I think the team, if it's a team sports setting, or it really doesn't matter, just any college sports setting, usually you have the sport in there that you're going to get some sort of loading or stimulus, some physiological stimulus or overload. But the biggest thing is, are they adapting? Ultimately, when you're looking at these time constraints or time crunches, you have to give them a stimulus that they can adapt to. And a lot of the time, if they only come in for 35, 40 minutes and maybe they're not doing anything on the field or anything, if they're a swimmer in the pool or basketball court or wherever they are, I kind of bury them a little bit. I don't know about you guys, but you can afford to like use that window to bury them a little bit, overstress them, put a really intense session, something that's safe, obviously, but then, they basically taking off for, 3 days before they come back in. So they should recover by the time that they come back in.
Yeah.
My preferred way to do that is going to be density training.
Yeah.
So like a 10 by 3 on the minute for squats. So you're taking roughly 10 seconds or less for a set of 3. So you're looking at 50 seconds between sets. And we just had a study going on, or kind of just wrapping up now at Athletic Lab about this, looking at that protocol compared to others, but the velocity drop-offs are pretty close to 0. And even in a more extreme example, I've done as much, I think it was 22 sets of 2 power cleans at 70% on 90-second rest, and my fastest reps were 18, 19, 20, 21, and 22.
Wow.
So right when you would expect the most fatigue is in place, you get into this rhythm as you go throughout that. And a lot of times having those short sets keeps focus. It keeps a group very diligent. If you got 3 people on a rack, you can pretty much move. One athlete does a triple, quickly adjust weights if needed, second athlete, third athlete, and then you're back to number 1. So especially if whether you're for constraint of equipment, which isn't exactly what we're talking about today, but definitely happens with team settings, it can be a way to efficiently get a lot of work done in a shorter amount of time.
Yeah, I really like the density training. I actually take that almost a step further sometimes when I employ that to get some other work in, upper body or something else with it. So whether it's squat, power clean, or something like that, sometimes set that up as like, say, 10 sets of 2, and then almost in a wheel where that's the center, and then every time we do a set of squat, we go off to another exercise, come back to squat.
Yeah.
Go off to a separate number 2 exercise, come back to squat. Go off to number 3 exercise, and we just keep going around that wheel until effectively we get 12 sets of squat and maybe 4 sets of 3 other exercises. So keeps you moving the whole time. You're basically nonstop. You're getting a lot of squat. You can keep high effort because your other ones might be upper body or accessory leg or something like that, where it's not going to affect the squat too much. And you can put it on time if you want, or you can just move through. Depends on the load that you're putting on them.
Even if we are talking about like a squat in general, even when I do have time, I pretty rarely nowadays have squat truly on its own. Almost always have something with it.
Almost always an upper body at least, or a core.
I've done it a couple times, but only when I want a really high quality squat session, or if the athlete's really pushing for it. If they're like, I want to squat heavy today, or I want to do something like that, I might exclusively do that. But a lot of the time I'll pair it with a pull-up,
really
or
outside of
something like that.
Outside of testing, I really find it's pretty rare that I that aggressively load athletes
especially
again.
with the low amount of time spent with them, like two sessions or less a week.
I think for me it's less because just I have less time with them. Even athletes I've had for a lot of time that I feel comfortable putting that weight as a stimulus on them. I don't have control over the other however many hours they get through the week with their coach, or if they have practice coming up later that day. I don't know if that's going to be a low intensity or a high. And a lot of times the sport coach doesn't even necessarily know that, so it's hard to anticipate what else is going on. So I'll usually be a little bit safer on those.
Yeah, I think too, ultimately we're looking at outcomes here. So, I mean, what type of outcomes have you guys seen working with athletes 2 times a week for an hour or something like that? Have you guys seen big performance jumps? Because in my experience, I have. But like I said, this is the first time I've worked with them 2 hours a week. Yeah. I've seen big jumps because they're younger.
Right. You can get good gains if you set it up well, if you're efficient, and if you cover all your bases. So if you leave things out of it, if you don't prioritize, then you'll have holes in your performance, same as you have holes in your training. So I think the biggest thing is what I try to do if I have just 2 or less sessions a week is check all the boxes. So, good solid warm up, get a couple coordination drills in for speed work, do a couple sprints, do some type of jumping, whether it's low level, high level, whatever, and then get all your strength work in, and make sure we hit each piece of the strength that you want, push, pull, squat, hinge, all that stuff. So if you can do all that stuff within the same session, you're gonna see gains for sure.
Yeah. Do you want to elaborate maybe on?
Yeah, one good example would be a baseball athlete I've worked with this year, and we changed depending on the time of year what we're focusing on. So when we were really focusing on upper body strength, I did include bench press with him, even though we kind of talked about that's not always the most efficient. For him, having a big upper body strength stimulus was going to be important. We were still having pull-ups involved there. That's probably more specific, you could argue, for a throwing athlete, but I wanted that in there. So that's another example that you talked about. You had to consider the athlete and the scenario. So more often than not, I use push-up, but for him at this time of year, I felt it was appropriate to use bench press. Over 4 weeks, we put about 10 pounds on his bench press then. So from the high 190 to, I think, 209. It's in kilos, so the conversion of pounds is a little bit messy. Once we were focusing on eccentric strength with K-Box, then you're looking at depth jumps, more true eccentric work. 4 weeks of training from test to retest, approach vertical from 29 to 33 inches. So there's no question that on 2 weeks you can do, or not 2 weeks, twice a week you can do work.
Yeah.
But you may have to arrange it a little differently than initial instinct might.
It's all about prioritizing
Yeah.
for the outcomes that you want. Just like you were saying, pick your goals, pick the most important goals, and prioritize based on that.
Yeah. I mean, in my experience, 2 days a week, I was able to get a girl, came in squatting just a 15-pound dumbbell, and now she did 77 pounds for sets of 3 on density, which is, I mean, doing multiple sets of 3, it wasn't like, one set of just triples or a heavy triple or something like that. I don't think that would be appropriate at her age. But to get that coordination, to get her used to a full squatting with weight on her back, I mean, that was probably 6 weeks and her squat went up that much. So
Knowing the athlete I mentioned and the one you mentioned, I think something that's important is to the athlete's role in this and how they actually get after it.
Yeah.
Because if you're talking 2 hours a week,
Definitely.
you got to use that time.
Yeah.
And so from a coaching standpoint, that's something that I find is pretty individual on how is the best way to actually drive that intent. We use a lot of times, whether it's going to be things like the push bands to actually show how fast you were moving on that set. All right, that set was slower than your last one. Try to pick it up on this next one here. Putting out timing gates at arbitrary distances to actually show that what's going on there. Partly it's for us to know what's going on, but also it can drive the intent of the athlete. Some don't care about that, and it's a competitive thing, having a training partner in there with them that they don't like to lose to. But having that intent throughout those sessions is going to be even more important if you're training less. Both the athletes we mentioned are prime examples of this because they get after it.
yeah.